Okay, let's start. Thank you very much. My name is Paul Keneally. I'm the Head of Media for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and I'll be moderating this press conference this morning. And as I mentioned earlier, thank you very much for those of you who have come. Basically, today we're going to stress very much the urgency that we are faced with in the field, based on the reality of our experiences and the humanitarian work that we do, the urgency that is needed to address the humanitarian consequences of climate change. For us, the writing is on the wall. We are facing this with every day, and we need to scale up very much our responses collectively across the board. Why is the humanitarian community here today gathered in Poznan? We're here to share our analysis and our concerns based on the reality of our everyday experiences. We are here to stress the humanitarian impact that climate change is having on millions of lives on a daily basis, and that increasing the vulnerability and exposure of communities at risk around the world. And importantly, we come here because we believe with our unity of purpose, our experience, our capacities, our resources, our networks, that we can support governments, civil society organisations and vulnerable communities to better cope and adapt to the horrendous humanitarian impact of climate change. Last but not least, we are here today because this is what we signed up to in Bali 1 year ago, a collective responsibility to address the humanitarian consequences of climate change. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the speakers. We have at the far end of the table, Mr. Jose Riera, Senior Policy Advisor for the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR. UNHCR brings to the table its long experience in dealing with population movements to tackle the issue of climate-induced displacement and migration. Beside myself, we have Mr. Reid Basher, Coordinator for Policy Development with the UN International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, ISDR. The ISDR aims at building disaster-resilient communities by promoting increased awareness of the importance of disaster reduction as an integral component of sustainable development. Next to Mr. Riera, we have Mr. Casidas Rochanacorn, Director of OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Geneva. OCHA is the leading humanitarian actor responsible for ensuring a principled and effective coordination of humanitarian action in collaboration with national and international partners. Last but not least, and the first person to speak today, is Mr. Bekele Galata, Secretary General for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Bekele is the leader of the largest humanitarian network in the world today, with the ability to call on 150 years of experience and mobilise some 100 million volunteers. The Red Cross has a unique contribution to make, given that it is rooted in and working with the very communities that need our support. Mr. Galata.
Thank you. We are here because of climate change. Climate change, as our facilitator says, is a global problem. It's a global problem, but its impacts are felt locally. It leads to more frequent and more extreme weather events, and so much more and bigger disasters with serious consequences to lives and livelihoods happen because of climate change. Everybody is affected by climate change in one way or another. But the poorest people in the poorest countries are affected much more than others. Climate change is caused by the sum of human activities everywhere. And it is only by mobilizing collective human action from all over the world that we can actually have a chance of solving it. No community, organization, or government can single-handedly deal with the consequences of climate change. The key is to forge partnerships, share resources and expertise, and work together. That's why the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent is pleased to be associated with Interagency Standing Committee to engage in a coordinated interagency vision for the climate change negotiations in Poznan and beyond. We must invest much more in disaster risk reduction as part of climate change adaptation. This is self-evidently sensible in terms of saving lives and livelihoods from disasters. Investment must be predictable, long-term, and systematically planned. For every $1 invested in risk reduction, we can save $3 to $10 in disaster response costs. Extreme weather events cannot be prevented, but they do not always have to lead to devastating or catastrophic disasters. Red Cross, Red Crescent is the largest humanitarian organization with tens and millions of volunteers, and the organization capacity to mobilize the volunteers. And through its volunteers, it deals with disaster risk reduction, grassroots development, and response when and if disasters take place. From Red Cross, Red Crescent perspective, disaster risk reduction and risk management means helping communities to better understand the hazards around them, cut down inducing factors to disasters, become better prepared to cope with those disaster events that are inevitable, improve access to information from early warning systems so that they have maximum notice of an incoming disaster, know what to do when disaster does strike so that people and assets can be protected as best possible, and once disasters have taken place, recover from them, probably build back better. Practically, the Red Cross, Red Crescent is doing a lot on the ground. In West Africa, for example, national societies, the Red Cross national societies disseminate information, scientific information to communities to protect themselves from floods. In Solomon Islands, national societies disseminate traditional knowledge for planting seeds during planting season. In Bangladesh, the National Society is doing door-to-door dissemination to national societies so that people protect themselves from floods. There are small-scale local actions being undertaken by national societies, such as protecting water wells before anticipated flooding, planting trees against landslides or desertification, small-scale drainage works, etc. Now, climate change is here. It is now. It's very urgent. People live it all over the world. And they are working to protect themselves against it. They are doing a lot, but their capacities are limited. They contribute to the solution. They partner with their governments, they partner with their partners, such as the Red Cross. They know that climate change is there. They know that disasters are coming. They know that the disasters are coming in intensity, and more severity. They want to be supported. And governments around the world, yes, they are working, yes, they are seriously committed to mitigation, but it's important that they commit equally to adaptation as well. In adaptation, the humanitarian aspect will have to be seriously considered. Because in the final analysis, people matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Galeta. Next speaker, I would like to introduce Mr. Casidas Rochanakorn, the Director for OCHA in Geneva.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Just very quickly want to repeat what the previous speaker highlighted. The climate change is here and is here now. We, from the human community, have been feeling that impact The impacts are clear to us. The burden is getting heavier. During the past 20 years, the number of recorded disasters has doubled over 100%, from roughly 200 to 400. Today, floods are happening more frequently. In 1985, we used to have 50 floods per year. In 2005, the number jumped to 200. Floods today, when it occurred, damage much larger areas than it used to in the past. Demand for humanitarian funding for response to natural disaster caused by extreme climate events have also increased considerably. As of today, recorded contribution for natural disaster response in 2008 total over $960 million, up from $800 million a year ago. And in compared to 2006, we need only $250 million to deal with natural disaster. The total number of urgent international appeals raising money to deal with natural disaster had jumped considerably. So these are the evidence clearly pointing to the need for us to step up action. As far as the humanitarian community is concerned, the impacts of climate change are here and are real, and we need to deal with that. Within our community, we have the knowledge, we have the expertise, we have experience, we have the framework for coordination, we have the funding mechanism to deal with the impacts of climate change. The problem we're facing today is that that capacity is being overwhelmed because of the frequency and intensity of natural disaster. And we need your support to make sure the world is prepared to step up action to support our community so that we can do better. And we need that support now. We're here sitting together from the humanitarian community, from the risk reduction community, wanted to speak with one voice, calling for all of us to step up action to reduce risk and also step up emergency preparedness so that we can save lives. What I would like to say is that floods, drought, storms themselves do not have to end in disaster. They don't have to kill. People don't have to die because of floods, because of drought, because of storm. They die because they're not prepared. They are dying because we're not equipped them, empower them to be adaptive enough to face the extreme events. And this is something that we need to do. I think we need to work on. If you looked at the Myanmar situation, in May 2008, over 100,000 people perished because of cyclone. Did they have to die? In comparisons, in November 2007, Cyclone Sit made landfall in Bangladesh, a few hundred kilometers away. It's category 5. Only 3,000 people died because of that event. Lesson clearly indicated that the reason why Bangladesh did much better because the community has been able to adapt itself much more effectively to deal with such an extreme event. And from that lesson learned, I think we need to work together to step up our efforts. We can deal with climate change. We can deal with its impact, but we have to work together. The impacts of climate change spanned over many disciplines. It cut across many sectors. It sees no national boundary. So we need to work together, first among the international actors, between the international actors and the regional actors, between the regional actors and the national authorities, and ultimately with the local population. We need to work together in strong partnership. We need to build this community so that we can become more resilient to deal with the impacts of the climate change. And we from our international community stand ready to play that role. But we need your support. We need the world to recognize that the impacts are here and are real so that we can work together. At the Bali, I think we have all agreed that the principle to reduce risk is a sound one. We have agreed to act together to reduce risk. We have to transform the words into action, and that's what we're facing right now here today. And the challenge for the UNFCCC parties right now is to make sure that we take into account, we take into consideration the humanitarian impacts of climate change. The problem is that we've been seeing climate change today more as environmental issue, as biodiversity issue. But from our side, we see that impact. We want to make sure that the world understands that please look at it also from humanitarian developmental perspective. and we can deal with the situation. Because at the end of the day, it's the people that count. Our business is to deal with the people. And I believe that we're talking about climate change today because we want to make sure that we, together, can make a difference to the life of the people we need to serve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rochanakorn. I'd like to now pass the baton to Mr. Jose Riera, Senior Policy Advisor for UNHCR.
Yes, good morning. You know, the UN Refugee Agency has been dealing with forced displacement, conflict-produced, internal strife, etc., for decades. One of the reasons why I'm sitting here on this podium is the fact that we are convinced that climate change will change the nature and the root causes of movements in future. Climate has always been one element, one of the reasons forcing people to move, but not the primary reason. What we risk seeing in the coming months and years is climate suddenly becoming the main driver of movements. Now, no one has a crystal ball, but even conservative estimates predict about 250 million people being forced to move by climate change in the coming years. If we break that down annually, that's about 6 million people on the move. Now today, UNHCR takes care of about 10 million refugees and a large number of internally displaced persons. When you're talking about 6 million additional people on the move, you can see that the challenges are actually quite big. And we have questions. Who will be taking care of these people? What kinds of rights will they enjoy? Will they be forced back to their countries even if the conditions are not there? So we think that climate change has a human face, and we wanted to bring that message here to Poznan. It's not only an environmental issue, it's an issue of people who are suffering today and of people whose suffering can be alleviated tomorrow if we all act together. And in fact, the very fact that you have such a range of agencies on this podium is already a demonstration that the humanitarian community, at least, has come together and with one voice is seeking to ensure that the outcome here in Poznan, beyond talking about carbon emissions and about funding, also makes a strong assertion, and that is that climate change is primarily a matter of men, women, boys, and girls all over the world, and it's those lives that we have to address. What kinds of movements will we be looking at? Most probably we'll be looking at internal displacement, that is, the movements of people within their own countries. But if we know that the most vulnerable states are those in the developing world and often the least developed states, the irony is that they will have the least capacity actually to respond and to react. And that's where the value of the humanitarian community comes in. We're on the ground, we're there. We already have programs in most of these countries. In fact, I brought some maps at the entrance to this room which overlays the current presence of displaced persons and refugees around the world with risk of drought, risk of flooding. And it's very easy and very visual to see that our clients, if you like, are precisely in the most disaster-prone areas. So they've suffered once, they'll suffer again alongside their communities. We also have noted that there are a number of legal and operational gaps that need to be filled. The refugee frame, the refugee convention, is something that's been around for 50 years and has proved quite robust and quite flexible. But what will happen tomorrow if we suddenly see movements of 100,000 or 200,000 people crossing a border in one day? So we need to begin really to sit down with states and to look at this issue and to see what kind of response is needed for these movements. We're not talking about people fleeing conflict, but we're talking about people in a similarly, or will be talking about people in a similarly catastrophic situation. And a final point is on the role of women and girls. To give you an example, in Africa, women produce 90% of food for domestic consumption. They're responsible for household water, and they normally meet the energy needs of their families. So not only are they the first to understand the importance of preserving and managing scarce resources, but without women, any grassroots efforts will be doomed to fail. So part of the message today is also to say, let's not forget women. They rock the cradle. They, in some cases, rule the world. But they're also key to responding to the risks of climate change, to being ready, to readying their families, their communities, and to playing a proactive role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose. Last but not least, I'd like to pass the floor to Mr. Reid Basher from the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, after which we will open the floor to questions and answers from gathered media. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I represent the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. This is a widely endorsed multi-stakeholder movement involving the United Nations, governments and civil society to look at the root causes of disasters and to coordinate action towards reducing vulnerability and reducing risks. Disasters are not just the big events you see on the television. There are thousands of smaller events that occur every year that take lives, that wipe out villages and families and destroy livelihoods. This is not a single issue. This is an issue that covers development concerns, humanitarian concerns, and of course it draws on very important technical knowledge about hazards and society's organisation. And so I'm very happy to be here today to provide more emphasis than usual on the humanitarian aspects of the disaster problem, and to be partnered here with the major agencies concerned with humanitarian relief, humanitarian response, and humanitarian organisation. But let's have a look at disasters. It would be easy to assume that all disasters are due to climate change. Now, for sure, the changing climate is having some effects on the hazard side of the equation. But what about the human side, the social side of the equation? Here we find that we are not at all well adapted to the existing climate. So we do things like stripping off forests. We do things like destroying wetlands. We remove the protection that nature has given us in the past and make ourselves addedly vulnerable to the effects of hazards. There are many, many examples of how unsustainable development is actually making risks worse. And we have to get this under control because we have the looming issue of climate change and the context that increased climate hazards will have is the context in which the extra hazards occur will be something that will make the effects much greater than they otherwise would be. We really risk unleashing rather serious consequences if we are not better prepared. Better prepared for humanitarian consequences, but also better prepared in the sense of not messing up our environment, not building settlements in places that are highly risky. So, this is a positive message though, because actually we know how these risks emerge and we know what to do about them. There are many tools, many methods. We know about early warning systems, we know about proper land planning, we know about building codes, but do we properly implement them? And the answer to that is sometimes, but often we don't. And as a result, we're making things worse for ourselves and really putting almost like a time bomb there waiting for climate change to reveal the hazards, the risks that we've been developing over the many years. So we have the tools, we have the information, and we have one very important tool, that is the Hyogo Framework for Action. This was agreed by governments in 2005 following the tsunami at the World Conference on Disaster Reduction, and it lays out very clear priorities for reducing risk. These priorities should be looked at very, very carefully in terms of adaptation, because it's largely the same issue, largely the same ways of reducing risk. You have to have proper legislation in place. You have to have the knowledge bases there. You have to activate your community capacities to identify and reduce risks. So there are many, many things there, and it's really a no-brainer. It's a no-regrets approach to be able to take this information and put it at the disposal of adaptation policies. And in the humanitarian area, the organisations, the capacities, well, perhaps not the capacity, but the information is there, but there are many capacities that remain to be fully developed. Having a tool in one country is not enough. They have to be in all countries. They have to have those capacities developed, especially in the vulnerable developing countries. So with that, I'll finish and note that later there will be this workshop on Thursday. The ad hoc working group on long-term cooperative action will be looking very specifically at that. The parties have requested this, on Friday. That's not tomorrow, but on Friday at 1 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reid, and to all the speakers. I'd like now to open the floor to the gathered journalists, and also just to note that we have also some specialists in the audience on disaster risk reduction, as well as the Director of the World Food Programme from Geneva, Mr. Jean Vincent. Thank you. Thanks. To identify your name and your organisation. Thank you.
Guy Molson from Associated Press. I appreciate that risk reduction isn't all about money, but I wonder if the panel can put some kind of a price tag on your call for scaling up action to reduce disaster risk. How much money might be required over what sort of period, and what kind of costs are you looking at if that action isn't taken?
Okay, I'll let Reid take that.
Of course, there's a lot of calculations to be done, but there are a couple of pointers that we can pay attention to. One is that the Stern report estimated that the adaptation costs will be in the order of maybe 50 billion a year. If, in the first instance, you start paying attention to risk issues, it'll be some large fraction of that. So we're talking tens of billions of dollars a year. A second line of thought on this is some countries have indicated that they would wish to spend roughly an extra 10% of their humanitarian budgets on risk reduction. So you can multiply that up, and that also comes into the tens of billions of dollars a year. Germany and the UK in particular have identified that in the past.
Okay, this gentleman here.
Thank you very much. Richard Ingham from the French news agency, AFP. Could I ask you to amplify what you said about climate changes is having an effect now on disasters? I mean, there's a difference between weather and climate, isn't there? I mean, floods and storms, all these things have always happened. And as Mr. Bashir pointed out, if you house people in a vulnerable position and in poor buildings, and you don't give them early warning systems, well, you know, there's a disaster waiting to happen. What evidence do you have that these increase in disasters is related to climate change and not simple all the other factors of unsustainable development, poor preparations, and shoddy construction?
Let Reid take that.
Okay. Well, I don't have the expertise, by the way. And we have a climate change center that has been working on climate change as far as Red Cross is concerned. I would like Madeleine to comment on this.
This is Madeleine Helmer, the head of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, or Martin, sorry, Associate Director of the Climate Centre, Red Cross, Red Crescent from The Hague. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A very good question, of course, and I think the interventions we've heard underline the fact that the sort of conditions you mentioned are exactly the ones we should address. So let me emphasize that rising vulnerability is the key to the solution. Yeah, but the specific question about do we know how much of the current rise in disasters is due to climate change? The answer, unfortunately, is no. We do not know exactly how much is due to climate change. We do know that climate change is already playing a role in the rise in disasters. So I cannot give you a precise percentage, but I can point to the IPCC evidence that for a number of the extreme events that are responsible for the major proportion of disasters that we see in our statistics, almost 90% of those disasters are weather and climate related. And for the majority of those climate-related disasters, we see IPCC already indicating that those extreme events have already gotten worse, likely or very likely.
Okay, Martin.
We see that trend continuing into the future.
Martin, thank you very much. We'll have to wrap up now because there's other people queuing up at this stage for the next press conference. I would like to take the opportunity to also propose bilateral discussions or interviews with the media to go further into depth on these issues, either with our specialists or with the senior leaders from the gathered organisations here. And to remind you that this evening at 7:30 there will be a side event on the humanitarian response to climate change titled Early Warning, Early Action. That will take place at 7:30 this evening, and there will be food served at it. So I want to thank you again very much for gathering here, and sorry to the organisers for running a little bit over time. Thank you.
I beg your pardon.
Okay, sure.